Welcome, everyone, to Reinventing Leadership in the Transatlantic Relationship. This event is brought to you by a partnership between the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. My name is Adam Stulberg, and I'm Sam Nunn Professor and Chair at the Nunn School. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a full degree offering School of International Affairs in a sea of engineering, which gives us a distinct vantage point and focus to our research, teaching, and outreach at the nexus of science, technology, and international affairs. Let me begin today's program by noting that it is part of a longstanding Sam Nunn Bank of America Policy Forum series that really brings together prominent people from the worlds of academia, industry, government, and policy analysis, different technology sectors, and yes, students, to reflect on burning issues at the nexus of international affairs, science, and technology that really directly affect the global condition. This year, in light of our new realities, we have throughout the course of 2021, a three-part virtual, or I should say hybrid, series of events. This one being the kickoff that really addresses the issue of reinventing leadership in the transatlantic relationship. It will be followed later in the spring in a few months with a panel discussion that will pick up some of these themes, especially related to the great power dimension to the relationship. And in the fall, we'll have another one, hopefully in person at that point, where we address how emerging technologies are affecting the 21st century nuclear equation in the transatlantic relationship and the new challenges that they pose for risk reduction, arms control, and strategic stability. So please stay tuned with us throughout the year and look out for notices about these events. But enough about the future, because we really do have a packed agenda for you today. And after turning to our own former Senator Sam Nunn to offer some framing questions, my dear colleague, Professor Alasdair Young, who is the Neal Family Chair, as well as an EU Jean Monnet Scholar and the co-director of our Center for European and Transatlantic Studies here at the Nunn School, will introduce our distinguished speakers. And after their respective remarks, he will moderate discussion as well as feather in questions from you, the audience, through the chat mechanism. So let me conclude my welcome with a few things. One, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, which is Bank of America, for not only sponsoring this series, but all of their other initiatives with us for this very generous support. I also want to thank our friends at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for this wonderful partnership, both for this high-level discussion and the panel discussion that will follow later in the spring. And I especially want to thank the outgoing president, Ambassador William Burns, for his steadfast commitment to this partnership amidst his own transition as President Biden's nominee for the next director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And finally, let me introduce our own former Senator Sam Nunn, who really does not need an introduction to this audience. But I would like to remind you that during his long tenure in the U.S. Senate, he served as chair of the Armed Services Committee and Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. During that tenure, he championed hallmark legislation such as the Department of Defense Reorganization Act, and for us today, of course, the Cooperative Threat Reduction legislation, which was really played a critical role as a ballast of that initial transition from the Soviet collapse to the post-Cold War transatlantic relationship. Since leaving the Senate, he has served as co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and, of course, been a distinguished professor with us here at Georgia Tech. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Senator Nunn, who will offer some framing remarks for our substantive program today. Senator?
Thank you very much, Adam. And I'll start by thanking you, Adam, for your outstanding leadership of the Nunn School. You have really added a great dimension. Joe Bankoff did a tremendous job of laying a foundation, and you have really taken us to another level in your short tenure as the chair. So thank you, Adam. I want to join you in thanking Bank America for generosity of supporting this program, but also for the last, gosh, how many years has it been? 1997, the first Bank of America Nunn Forum took place on the Georgia Tech campus. So thank you. And I would ask Jill Toth and Tony Block, who I believe are on the line today, to thank all the team at Bank America for your continued generosity, and particularly making this program available, which we think is timely and important given the challenges we face in the Transatlantic Partnership. Grateful also, as Adam said, to Carnegie Endowment and to Bill Burns, who will soon be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a sterling appointment by President Biden. Bill Burns has chaired the endowment, and they are full partners in this program today. So we thank them. And I also have to thank, again, Adam and your team at the Nunn School, Alasdair Young, you'll hear from in just a moment, Jenna Jordan, Chris McDermott, for planning and coordinating today's program, and a couple of other programs we're going to be having over the next 6 or 8 months on this overall subject. Most of all, we're honored today to have two of the world's most experienced foreign policy and security experts joining us as the heart of our program today. Federica Mogherini and Jim Collins will be introduced properly by Alasdair in just a moment when I turn the mic over to him. But just let me add to his introduction in advance by saying these two diplomats are greatly respected and listened to carefully in Europe, in the United States, in Russia, and indeed worldwide. So we look forward to learning from both of you this morning in leading our discussion. Ambassador Bill Burns, that I referred to, who will soon take over as chair of the CIA, given Senate confirmation, which I would bet my bottom dollar will happen rapidly. Bill recently wrote, and I quote him, Europe is caught between an assertive China, a revisionist Russia, and an erratic America, end quote. Ambassador Burns went on in that article to call for a fundamental reexamination of America's role in the world. And of course, this discussion will touch on some of that reexamination this morning. A few questions on my mind. I have a lot of them, but I'm going to boil it down to 4 that I believe we will probably touch on this morning and in the next 2 seminars on this subject. The first question is, if you take the tremendous strain between the Trump administration and Europe as a starting point, and that encompassed disagreements over trade, over climate, over the Iran agreement, and over NATO, to name a few, as well as if you add to that the significant changes in Europe that have come about in the last 4 years. And if you put on top of that the challenges from Russia, and Jim Collins is a real expert, former ambassador to Russia. If you add all those together, the question would be for me to the Biden administration, or for the Biden administration, do we try to return to a traditional American leadership role, which has been somewhat missing in action in the last few years? Is that desirable or even possible given all of these tremendous changes that have occurred? My second question is, from a European perspective, what would be the recommendations for the Biden administration? What would be the sense of priorities from a European perspective? And I'm sure Federica will touch on that in terms of priorities for the Biden administration. And my third question involves Russia and China. Should the United States and Europe aim for a much more coordinated approach to Russia and China, at least on security, trade, and economic issues? Is that the direction we should be heading in? And then my final question is, what are our vital interests in dealing particularly with Russia and China. When I say we, I mean Europe and the United States, the Transatlantic Partnership, including but not limited to NATO. Should we treat sustained diplomacy and engagement with Russia and increasingly with China as a reward for good behavior, which it seems to me that's the direction we've had, not just in the previous 4 years, but probably in the previous 8 years. A lot of reasons for that, a lot of good reasons for that. But on the other hand, can we carve out and should we carve out existential mutual threats like nuclear, like biological, like climate change, for continuous and sustained dialogue, even when we have a continuation of vastly different values and differences on important regional issues? Can we carve out those threats that deal with the very existence of our countries and the future of our transatlantic partnership? So those are some of the questions I have, and I'm very, very interested in what Jim and Federica will be thinking and offering in terms of their observation on these and many other issues. So again, thanks to all who made today's program possible. I look forward to listening and learning. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Alasdair.
Schoolboy error. Left myself muted. Good morning. I'd like to add my welcome to our audience and our esteemed presenters. As the Senator outlined, this is an extremely timely subject, and I'm sure that you will have lots of comments and questions. In a moment, I'll invite each of our speakers to make brief opening remarks. I will then ask them some questions before taking questions from the audience. To ask a question, use the live chat feature in YouTube that you should see to the right of your screen. Now, I am honored to be joined today, albeit remotely, by Ambassador Collins and Rector Mogherini. James Collins is non-resident senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program and diplomat in residence at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001 and is an expert on the former Soviet Union and its successor states. Federica Mogherini is the rector of the College of Europe. From 2014 to 2019, she was the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission. Without further ado, Ambassador Collins, would you care to begin our discussion?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Senator Nunn. Senators posed questions that I think could take up all of our time if we simply picked on one of them. But I'd like to make a few points here and then give an indication of where I think maybe we know something about the new administration's trajectory regarding some of the key issues the senator raised. First, I'd like to say that with respect to the transatlantic community, I think there's one reality we all live with, and that is that Russia and that area to the east, the area that is the non-membership of Europe's institutions, has always played an extraordinarily important role in defining the importance of the transatlantic relationship. It did so in the 20th century, for the century of the Cold War, the post-Soviet period, and it continues to do so today. Now, Bill Burns called Russia a revisionist country. Yes, I'll come to that in a moment. But the issues that are arising about global order from both the Russia-Eurasia world and from Asia, but particularly China, are going to define in many ways the future of the transatlantic relationship, because how we react to them will be a very important determinant of how effective we are. And here I would simply remind Ben Franklin's note that if we hang together, we either hang together or we will hang separately. Now, with that said, I'd like to simply make a few points focused mainly on the Russia dimension here. But I happy to talk about other aspects that Senator Nunn raised and others. First, what are we dealing with Russia? What is Russia today to all of us, I think, in the transatlantic world? Well, I think it's pretty fair to say that it is pursuing a traditional nationalist and to some extent a revisionist role. But in many ways, if you look historically, it is a role that Russia and its predecessors, including the Soviet Union, have played for centuries. And it has always been a challenge to Europe and in the 20th century to Europe and the United States in terms of defining how we approach dealing with that challenge. And in many ways, it has defined us. It's created many of our institutions of the 20th century and today. So I think there's no question that how we approach the Russian Federation and its neighbors is going to be a critical part in shaping the way the US and the European community defines its relationship. Second thing I would say is that I personally hope that the United States has finally come to understand, and will understand under President Biden, that we are no longer in a position to be dispositive about much of anything. We have to work with other nations, we have to work with our allies, and we have to convince the global community to move in constructive directions. And we are no longer in a position to decide most important issues on our own or act as though we can. Now that requires a new approach in many ways to the way we conduct business. And I think President Biden has already suggested he understands the importance of building close and important relations of comity and cooperation with our allies as a critical element in giving us a strong enough voice to lead collectively in a constructive way in shaping the future global order. Now, Russia has its own views on this. Russia is, at the moment, concerned to reassert its position as a global leader. We can call it revisionist, whatever one wishes, but the fact is it is a globally oriented, globally active participant in the international order. Our problem is that in many ways it is not a very constructive engagement, to put it mildly. So we are going to find, it seems to me, essential for the community in Europe and the United States to work together in a constructive way and build a new consensus around how we're going to approach dealing with the Euro-Atlantic East. And that, I think, is a high priority for the Biden administration, and they've begun, I think, already to define an agenda. So let me just say a word or two about where I think that agenda is going. First, we know that a critical first element will be what I would call the hard security agenda, and in particular, the traditional issues of nuclear weapons and the new technologies and all of these things that so many people are writing about as the challenge we now face that's very much more complex than it was in the last century. Now, Mr. President has already extended the New START agreement. He's apparently raised the idea of trying to bring back something like Open Skies agreement. So in other words, it's clear that this hard security agenda and the issues that are being raised by the new technologies, the old technologies of nuclear, chemical, and so forth, weaponry, are going to be a critical entry in which we will engage the Russians. And I think it's going to be important as a subset of that to understand that it's no longer just the nuclear superpowers that have to talk, but we have to engage our allies in this effort if we're going to have an important outcome, because so much of the new technology is not a function of simply the two nuclear powers. Second matter on the agenda, it seems to me, are what I'll call regional issues. This is an old idea, but it is the question of Russian and I would say transatlantic community competition or issues arising around the world in everywhere from the Middle East to Latin America to Africa and in Asia. The Russian side is trying to ensure that its voice is heard in these areas. It's using its techniques and its strengths and financial capacity to insert itself in an active role. Carnegie's done a very good series on globalizing Russia. And I think it's worth understanding that Russia is back. Russia is a global power today. It has global reach, not like the United States, and certainly not like the transatlantic community taken together, but it has the capacity to act outside its region. Third area I would say is there that I think is important, and it plays a role in both of the previous two, is that we are engaged in some ways in a new systemic and ideological conflict or competition with the Russian side. I think it's fair to say that most of the transatlantic community has bought into the idea of a globalized world, and that globalization is a force one can't stop. But I think it's also fair to say that Russia has sought to become the voice and an ideological leader, in some sense, of the alternative. It has basically turned that to an anti-American dimension, but broadly speaking, it is anti-Western, and it is anti-democratic, and it is anti-liberal. It is fundamentally playing to the idea of tribalism, nationalism, that which divides. And I think in that sense, we face a genuine challenge, if you will, in the systemic role about how the future of global governance is going to develop and so forth. Fourthly, we have a global agenda. And in this, there may be some hope, like it is in the nuclear and hard security world, that we can work with Russia to address issues like climate change and other issues that, frankly, no single nation or even the community as important as the transatlantic world can resolve on its own. There may be openings there to work. And finally, it seems to me we have an economic dimension with the East. That is a question that is going to be perhaps one of the more troubling ones in terms of coming to common views with our European colleagues. The United States up to now has been largely relying on what I would only call weaponizing economic connections as a way to influence Russian behavior. I'm hoping that we will find a way to rethink some of that. Certainly sanctions are going to remain with us, but I would hope that we can think beyond simply turning to sanctions and punitive measures as a way to try to convince Russia to change some of its approaches to the issues that are important to us. So let me leave it at that. It's more a statement of an agenda than an answer to questions, and we can talk about the rest in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's certainly provided plenty of material for the subsequent discussion. Rector Mogherini, would you please share your thoughts?
With pleasure, and let me start by thanking you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to join you, and especially Senator Nunn, with whom we have shared in the past some nuclear-related work when we were in different capacities. It's a pleasure to join you from Bruges, virtually, where the College of Europe is, where I'm now the rector. And I'll try to share some thoughts and some views about how we feel on this side of the Atlantic about this new beginning for the United States, and also trying to answer to some of Senator Nunn's questions, at least try to. First of all, we are back to calling ourselves we. There is a community. In the last 4 years, for Europeans, it was quite difficult to say we, referring to United States and Europe together, not to mention the fact that in Washington, this was not really something commonly done. If I can use Kissinger famous question, what is the telephone number of Europe? In this last 4 years in Europe, we have had many times the feeling that we didn't know really what was the telephone number of Washington anymore. And even if we had the telephone number right, not everybody, there was someone picking up the phone on the other side, or maybe even when the calls were responded to, the answers were completely different depending on who was picking up the phone or at what time of the day he was picking up the phone. So this level of uncertainty and this level of being left alone was completely new for the Europeans, was painful in the beginning, was happening, as someone mentioned, in a moment when Europe itself was going through big changes. And I think was somehow useful for Europeans to realize that it's good to be allies. It's good to have a natural ally like the United States, but we have to get ready to stand on our own feet if needed, not only for ourselves and our interests and our values, but also, in some cases, as a point of reference for others. I think that, well, I was in office in the European institutions exactly in the last 2 years of the Obama administration and almost the entirety of the Trump administration. I realized that around 2016, many in the world turned to the European Union to do things together. Trade deals, human rights policies around the world, climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, anything. And we realized that we had a responsibility. So I think that as today we move to being again a transatlantic community that will act together and coordinate policies, indeed, as Senator Nunn mentioned, this I don't think will lead automatically to going back to the past. There's no golden age to go back to, first of all, because the world has changed. Second, because some wounds are deep, and I don't think that even if we're very happy to hear that America is back and everybody is relieved, I don't think that just saying that America is back will make America lead again, as it used to be the case before. Because in the meantime, there has been trust ruined or lost. There have been different trends and different dynamics and different processes developing. And Europeans and others in the world have realized, yes, that when America is not there, we miss it a lot, but also that we have some interests that we need to preserve and protect as Europeans or as Canadians or as Japanese, you name it. And I think that we will have now in this next months and years this mix of happiness and relief and a rush to coordinate policies as it should be, but also a certain level of preserving the instruments and the autonomy that we have developed in this that we've had to develop in this last 4 years. And I think this is good because it might lead us to a more mature partnership, a more mature relationship, where we might have Europeans taking more responsibilities for some files, but we might have a more equal burden sharing or responsibility sharing on some issues, including on security issues, including inside NATO. And I think that this will be helpful, as I mentioned, also because I guess that the administration will have to focus a lot on domestic issues. So it might be also obviously developing a multilateral cooperative approach worldwide, but probably also having to dedicate a lot of political capital and resources to reuniting the country internally, which is in itself a very important element for the rest of the world, because when America is not leading by example on democracy, on human rights, on respect, if I can put it this way, of diversity of its citizens, then the rest of the world misses a very important compass, if I can put it this way. So it is extremely important for us also to see an American renaissance inside Americans' borders. This has an impact on global politics, I think. Last but not least, on the rise or the fall of extreme right movements in our part of the world that got a lot of inspiration and contacts also in the United States. To look at what kind of priorities or expectations we have or Europeans might have when it comes to the Biden administration first steps or first priorities, I would say that the number one would be a shift in mentality, a shift in approach. For us, the real shock was, I think, a combination of the fact that, as Tillerson mentioned once when he was Secretary of State, he announced that from that moment onwards, the United States foreign policy would have been not human rights based anymore. This was literally probably one of the saddest moments we have lived in these last 4 years. We felt less empowered to follow a human rights agenda in the world, and some of our interlocutors around the world were, pointing at Washington and saying, "Are you sure that human rights are really priority? Because your main ally doesn't really feel the same." And this was empowering some of the countries that have more issues on human rights and rule of law, just to tell us, maybe democracy is not really a good idea. Maybe this is not the way in which the future of the world will go. And it was more difficult for us to argue the contrary. So the first shift is that we expect is that we are seeing already a shift towards a value-based, values-based, human rights-based foreign policy. We know well that a lot of economic interests also guide foreign policy, and a lot of security interests guide foreign policy. But having a partner across the Atlantic that doesn't disregard or doesn't diminish the importance of support to civil society and human rights activities is definitely not irrelevant for Europeans. The second big shift in narrative and in approach is the one from, I would put it this way, from the zero-sum game approach that Trump had, with this idea that anything could be solved with direct talks and a deal between normally it was two men across a table, to the multilateral approach, the cooperative approach, the approach that America has always had before Trump, no matter if with a Republican or a Democrat administration, that of looking for partnerships and cooperation. I think the United States have always had the intelligence to understand that investing in cooperative global order or regional orders was not charity, but it was an investment in its own safety and even in its own economic interests. The more the rest of the world is doing well, the better it is at the end of the day also for the United States. I think that this was not really the approach that Trump had. We felt very strongly that the logic in those last 5 years was I want to win and I want you to lose, which is not really the approach Europeans have and not really the approach that we would expect from the United States. So I think that the major points of expectation is this: a change in attitude, a change in approach, and willingness to reach out to partners, build cooperation, build partnerships and alliances, invest in them, starting from NATO, but not limited to that, reinvesting in the UN system. The first actions, rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate, go exactly in that direction. And I think that if I can imagine, probably some of the most relieved persons on the world stage might have been Stoltenberg and Guterres, because I think that without the United States on board, it's basically impossible both for NATO and the United Nations to properly function. The European Union sometimes has come in to substitute and compensate, but obviously there are some things that cannot really be done without the United States on board. So this to refer to the general trends. Then there are some specific issues on which I think Europeans would have an expectation from this administration in terms of policies and changes in policy, in foreign policy in particular. One is the possibility for the US to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. In this respect, I have to say that the presence of Wendy Sherman, if confirmed, with the hearing is a clear signal and reassuring, as well as a more active and committed United States on the entire arms control and non-proliferation file, which is something for which Europeans are always on board, but again, without the United States fully on board, it becomes difficult, both on the traditional challenge, but also on the new threats. For sure, we need to reopen some conversations on some of the big crises that are around us in Europe, and on which we didn't really have a lot of, to use a euphemism, an understatement, we didn't really have a lot of coordination with Washington in these last years. Middle East, Syria, completely disappeared from the radar screen, apparently. Libya, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Ukraine, the attitude of Russia towards the east of Europe. That is somehow a common shared geographical area that we have with our Russian neighbors. And here, but also far away areas, I think of Afghanistan, where in the last couple of years, coordination between Washington and Brussels and the European capitals has been basically inexistent, and it has been quite embarrassing, I think, for many to hear that the United States had committed to the withdrawal of troops of allies without even consulting the allies, and obviously this is not the direction to go. So I think that on all these files, we would expect to sit down together and define a common strategy or a division of labor to be somehow effective on these theaters. And then on Russia and China, Sam Nunn asked, I think, a very delicate question, a very important question. And I think already asking the question is a big step forward. Do we interpret engagement with Russia, but I would add even with China, as a rewarding step, or do we need it on certain fields, on certain files? The European approach has always been that of, for instance, in the case of Russia, never consider sanctions as the only element of our Russia policy. You need the sanctions in place, an element of pressure. Personally, I would be interested in discussing with someone that today here knows Russia much better than I do, to what extent the economic pressures linked to the sanctions are effective in changing the political course of decisions for a political regime like the one in place in Moscow. Because traditionally sanctions work more on institutional systems that are more, I would say, accountable to their own citizens and the economic sector. But apart from that, in Europe, we've always considered sanctions as one of the elements to be matched with engagement, sometimes with cooperation on certain issues. On climate change, both with China and with Russia, the Europeans have continued to work. We would have never managed to preserve what is left of the Iran nuclear deal if we didn't engage proactively and intensely with Russia and China to preserve it when the Trump administration decided to step out. On many other things that require global cooperation, but also on some controversial bilateral issues, the European way has always been that of engagement. And I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding around this in the United States. I know that the European policy towards China is now perceived as being softer than the American one. I don't think it is. The Europeans have had fights with the Chinese, and I've been part of some of them, extremely tough and extremely I would say even brutal in certain cases, always respectful, but we've never shied away from divergences and disagreements. And we even define China as a systemic rival, which is something that, as you can imagine, was not particularly appreciated in Beijing at a certain moment. And Personally, for instance, I've always visited human rights activists and civil society representatives whenever I was visiting China openly. But this doesn't mean that you should ignore the fact that you have to deal with China, you have to talk with China, and you have to also find ways and sectors on which you can cooperate with China. It's not going to disappear because you don't like it. It's there, and it's quite relevant on global dynamics. So the engagement strategy on the basis of clarity and clear priorities, and even divergences in the moment when they are spelled out in a transparent manner, in a clear manner, in a strong manner even, I think is the way to go, and I don't see really alternatives to that. So I think that even on that, and you can similarly reflect upon the sense of direction we can take on Russia in a similar manner. Again, are you going to ever solve Syria if you don't engage with Russia? Again, engaging doesn't mean agreeing. It means at least discussing and trying to define if there is a realistic, sustainable way out to some of the challenges and the crises that we have around us. So I hope that there will be, first of all, a systematic approach and a collective leadership, as you put it, to define how to deal with the world of today. Because, and I'll close with that, the impression we have in Europe is that today, much more than ever before in human history, we need collective leadership. We need to share analysis and ideas on the sense of direction. We need to support each other. Look at the pandemic. That, to me, today, together with climate change, is the real security threat we have. It doesn't know any notion of nationality, even if we see a rhetoric and a narrative of national competition sometimes. But we all know very well that unless we manage to solve this on a global level collectively, it will come back again and again. And the same with climate change, and the same with some of the hard security threats. So I really hope that knowing that the United States administration will have priorities at home, there will be a systematic, I would say, mapping together with Europeans and hopefully others to see what we can do together, who does what, on what we might disagree, and how we re-engage collectively into trying to solve some of the issues that are pressing today for both of us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rector Margarini. Those are two very thought-provoking interventions, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions. So to remind you, please use the live chat feature in YouTube, right to the right of the screen. To give you some thinking and typing time, I will start by asking some questions of my own. One of the recurring themes in the interventions by the Senator, the Ambassador, and the Rector is that we, to use a reinstated word, need to find a new way forward. We just can't go back to the way things were before. So I'd like to explore in a little bit more concretely what that might look like. Right, so starting with Ambassador Collins, in your remarks, you stressed the need for the US and the EU to work together with respect to Russia. You also identified some key areas for cooperation, such as nuclear weapons, pandemic, climate change, but also noted the administration's determination to hold Russia to account for its bad actions. So I was wondering if you could identify for us perhaps where and how you think that the US and its European allies might most fruitfully cooperate with respect to Russia.
Well, it seems to me that I would start on a sort of large scale. It seems to me that the real question in front of us is the degree to which the United States has absorbed the idea that we are no longer in the position we were in 1948 or 49 at the end of World War II, where, in a sense, we were in a position to define for what we called the free world, the agenda and how it was to be pursued. we now are in a position where we are certainly a major power, maybe the leading economy, the leading this, the leading that, but we are in most cases only one factor. And we need the support of our European friends and Japan in particular in order to build the kind of consensus about where we're going and how we're going to get there that will make us effective. So I think if I were to simply say it in general, it seems to me that on issues such as the relations with China and Russia, the United States and Europe have to engage in a pretty open dialogue and a pretty open discussion about what are the frameworks we are going to try to develop to deal with these two major powers, and how are we going to prioritize the kinds of issues that we have, and probably decide whether there is a division of labor to be had. I think it's probably fair to say that the United States will take the lead on nuclear and arms control. But it doesn't mean that we must not bring into account the views of our European friends. This is simply a reality. And we are, I think, at a moment where Mr. Biden, and I guess this is where I would say I'm hopeful. I think Mr. Biden's domestic policies have focused, as did his inaugural address, on the idea of unity, bringing us together. It seems to me that is going to extend into the international sphere. And he's talked about the need for bringing us together again as allies and friends to be strong. He's talked about a meeting of democracies and so on. So I think he understands that we must come together again, and we have to define our goals and our priorities together. And I think that's going to be the critical point.
Thank you. Rector Margarini, do you sort of see similar areas for working with the United States with respect to Russia?
Yes, I think, first, I think the first element, well, it's very reassuring that, first of all, President Biden has reached out to President Putin very early. To me, this was a reassuring step to see engagement and clarity of messages, and also the extension of the New START treaty. This has been something that has worried us Europeans because, as the ambassador mentioned, we recognize that on arms control and nuclear issues, there has to be an American-Russian lead or dialogue or decision, but we are in between. And what happens is not irrelevant for our own security. So indeed, we need to be part of the equation, at least to be reassured that a lack of agreement on arms control and nuclear issues between them would not affect the security of our continent, as it would have been self-evident a few decades ago. Without the memory of the Cold War might be a bit lost, but it's not lost in Europe. Just yesterday we were celebrating the Holocaust Day, and I can tell you that even if generations have passed, but we still feel the scars of the post-World War landscape on our territory. So this for sure is one element where Europe needs to be closely associated, even if we recognize the need to have America leading. I would say NATO is probably one of the fields where we expect the United States to re-engage significantly and fast, because we have many European countries have felt I would say I've doubted about the real intentions of the United States when it comes to their territorial protection. Even if I think that the Pentagon has always been very clear on this, but the White House not always. And don't forget that there are some European countries that have long borders and difficult history with Russia. I would say that Ukraine would be, for sure, one of the issues on which we would expect to sit down together with the State Department. And well, I say we as Europeans. I don't represent anyone but myself today, but I bring some memories and expectations. I think are more or less clear. I would say that there is an expectation that on Ukraine, policies can be coordinated. Let me say that the European Union has, in this last 4 years, delivered to Ukraine the largest ever package of financial support and technical support that the European Union has ever delivered to any other country. So I think there is an expectation now to share that burden somehow and to share the policies. And also, and let me go back to the Middle East, because again, I see Russia extremely active there. I think and I hope the new administration will have a look at the once upon a time Middle East peace process. Obviously, in the UN Security Council framework, nothing can be really discussed if not also together with Russia and Syria again, because we tend to forget. But again, still, it's quite a pressing issue for us in Europe. And last but not least, Central Asia and Afghanistan, because I think that these are the other parts of the world where we need to work together and possibly also engage with Russia to see how things can be stabilized, prevented, some economic opportunities taken. And for sure, again, I think that I would say consistent, serious, content-based dialogue is needed. And if we do that together, I think it might lead to something good.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you for a moment. In your remarks, you noted the perceived differences in how the US and the EU approach China. You suggested that they might be overstated. There are some that see the recent political agreement on the EU-China investment deal as evidence that the US and the EU do continue to see China differently, which could potentially hinder cooperation. Could you please talk a little bit about what you see the prospects are for US-EU cooperation with respect to addressing Chinese economic and human rights policies?
Well, I can share an anecdote with you. I was in office during probably the most difficult and conflictual, even verbally violent at certain moments, summit between the European Union and China. And that was over steel overproduction and access to Chinese market and investment and level playing field. Apart from the human rights issues that were always on the table. And in that moment, I remember perfectly well, the European Union turned towards Washington. Trump was in the White House, and we suggested that we should have coordinated our policies towards China, because together we can have obviously a much bigger and relevant impact when it comes to affirming or either containing some of the policies of China or bringing China towards a more cooperative or a more transparent economic cooperation. And the reaction we got was that the European Union and its countries were defined as foe and put on a sanctions list exactly on steel, if I'm not wrong, because of security reasons, being us allies in NATO. That was happening exactly as we were negotiating with China our steel production issues. And that created, I think, a sense of how could I say? Well, it gave to the Chinese an excellent reason to tell us, you're left alone. Don't count on your American friends. And it gave to Europeans a sense of being left alone. And so that was somehow, I think, making Europeans realize that that we had to define our China policy in a realistic manner, not necessarily counting on the United States to do it with us. I think that today, if we sit together, if the not only the State Departments but also probably the White House and the top leadership of the European Union or the trade departments sit down together and see how to approach jointly, or at least in a coordinated manner, issues we have with China, both on trade, on investments, and also on human rights, for sure, and democracy. For sure, we would come to some joint strategy and some joint positions. I have no doubt of that. The perceptions are different, but I think that the substance of it is exactly similar. But again, take into consideration that Europeans were not only left alone, but exposed to being less empowered and less meaningful in that moment, in a very difficult negotiation that at the end of the day finished quite well, but the scars remain. And this is why I very much share this opinion that a simple going back to the past will not work, because first of all, the past is not present anymore. The world has changed. There's no the world of before, but also because sure, administrations change, and we know that this administration is different than the previous one, very different, couldn't be more different. But you know, you learn the lesson of being left alone, and trust needs a little bit of time and investment to be restored fully. And there will be the need for a little bit of extra care put into healing these wounds only. The message of uniting America and uniting again the allies around the world requires energy and dedication, I think, on the American side. It will not come naturally like that, automatically like that. But again, I'm 100% sure that if the teams sit down, and I know that this was offered and proposed already to Washington from the European Union side, to sit together and go systematically through all the different China files to see convergences and seek convergence. I am 100% sure that this would be found easily and on basically every single aspect of relations with China.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Collins, are there any issues on which you think that the United States might cooperate with Russia in terms of dealing with concerns about China?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to just make one comment following on Rector Margarini's points. I think it's important probably for our European friends to understand what I'm convinced is the case. And that is, yes, President Trump was a bit of an aberration, it seems to me, but maybe he was the culmination of what has been a multi-decade sort of evolution in American thinking, American reality. And one of the legacies of this is, and one of the legacies that's going to last from Mr. Trump, is the idea that America First is a part of the way in which all political leaders are now going to have to sell their policies to the American people. They're going to have to explain how this is good for the American people. Now, I don't suppose you can say that they ever had any other choice, but the reality was Americans just assumed we were on top for most of the end of the 20th century and first part of this century. But suddenly today, that is no longer the case. And so I think, put quite simply, the Americans will be looking for support as well as, in a sense, alliance, as we define our policies and see how they are sort of advancing the cause of the American people. Now, with respect to China, I think the one significant difference between Europe and ourselves is that we are a Pacific power. We are not just an economic power in the area, in the region. We are a military and a strategic power. And in fact, we have interests that date from the end of World War II in the Pacific, a war that, by the way, has never really been completely resolved. And we have commitments in that region that engage us in ways that are far beyond just the economic dimension. And so that makes our role a more complicated one. Now, I think it would be a big mistake, frankly, for the United States to try to engage in the relationship between China and Russia. There is no way we're going to win on that one. I think for whatever we can do, we need to ensure that both dimensions of that relationship see it in their interest to have decent relations with the United States, and I would hope with our broader transatlantic community, and that they need to cooperate with us in areas where it's in their own interest to do so. Now, I don't happen to believe that the purported close relations or relations of semi-alliance that is being advertised in Russia as the new relations with China really has a very strong foundation. But I think any effort to exploit differences there would be a very dangerous game, and I would strongly advise we stay away from that. That said, I think engaging with both is very important, and trying to understand, trying to make clear policies that will be in the interest of each, China and Russia, is going to be a very important part of what we and our allies work out as the approach to both parties.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, and I want to turn to some audience questions. So Jack Shelton essentially asked, now we're having a new approach. We're talking about we need to have a new approach to the transatlantic relationship. And he's asking, do we need new institutions for that new relationship, perhaps to tackle issues that were not to the forefront before, like climate change? I don't know which one of you wants to take that first.
Personally, I think, if I may, personally think that the institutions we have in place, well, we have two main institutions. We have the UN system at large, but this is not specifically transatlantic, but we can use the transatlantic community somehow, the transatlantic coordination within the UN system, both to reform the UN system, but also to make it work on some particular files in one direction or another. And then obviously we have NATO as a military alliance. I don't think we need new institutions to reinvigorate or reinvent the transatlantic partnership. I just noticed that among the very first acts of this administration was that John Kerry spent, if I'm not wrong, 2 or 3 hours in a video conference with the leadership of the European Commission and the High Representative of the European Union on how to reinvigorate a common green agenda across the Atlantic. This is more valuable than any institution you can put in place. This is immediate and don't need to reinvent the wheel. You need to make it work. You need to put the policies in place, you need to put the resources sometimes in place, and you need to coordinate action. And again, I think that sometimes we get lost in Europe, starting from Europe, we get lost sometimes in interinstitutional or institutional discussions to hide the lack of political will. If you have enough political will, the institutions we have are more than enough. That's my personal thinking.
Ambassador Collins, would you concur?
Yeah, I'd concur with that. I'm not sure we need any more institutions. What we need is a different sort of mindset about how we approach diplomacy and how we approach decision making. And I think that has to include the idea that, one, we are going to listen, but two, we are also going to consult with our friends and allies early on in almost any major decision we are going to take that affects their interests and the role we're going to play in things like climate change and so forth. We cannot move alone in these things. And I think Mr. Biden sort of understands that. He understands the role of allies will have to play. But he's got to inculcate into the administration the idea that we don't make a decision and then tell them what it is. We need to consult and we need to engage in the decision-making process, or, if you will, talk with people and listen before we come to our own decisions or we have a collective decision.
I couldn't agree more. Very wise words.
Great. Well, we're making progress. I have a question from Mike a lot, and we've kind of touched upon this to an extent. I'll start with you, Ambassador Pons, because this is a Russia-specific question. But it's sort of what can we do? Again, bringing back in do to get Russia to respect the sovereignty of its neighbors and the human rights of its people? Is there realistic tools that we have to influence its behavior?
Well, I mean, I think essentially what is being asked here is how do we induce the Russians to see that it is in their own interest to return to a situation in which they respect their neighbors' sovereignty and their interests, and come to terms with the idea that they have to advance their own interests by, if you will, observing the sort of principles that have guided us in the Euro-Atlantic community for decades. Now, I think myself that as a general premise, the Americans have been obsessed with the idea that we can compel the Russians to do this. If we just find the right formula, use the sanctions right, engage in punitive measures to the extent we can find them. Obviously, we can't go to war because it's been made very clear that we're not going to have a nuclear exchange. So that is out off the table. So we have to find the other ways. The problem, frankly, is that sanctions and punitive measures really haven't produced. We do not see changes in behavior. Yes, they've affected the economy, and yes, they've had certain effects, but they haven't changed basic behavior. So it seems to me that the critical point is that we're going to have to get back to relying on diplomacy and engagement, and trying to work a system in which we come to terms that will find a way to persuade the Russians that observing, say, Ukrainian sovereignty is in their interest. Now, I don't have the formula for that, but I'm quite persuaded we'll not get there unless we begin to engage diplomatically in trying to find it. We're going to continue to have the punitive measures and the sanctions, but clearly that's not enough, and it won't be enough. So we have to engage here, it seems to me, with our allies in doing the maximum we can to find a diplomatic way through this and persuade the Russians that there's more to be gained by observing the rules than violating them.
Thank you. Rector Margarini, that sounds very much along the lines of the European approach. Do you have anything to add?
Indeed, that's exactly the kind of thinking that has been developing in these last years in Europe. At first, in 2014, we struggled a bit to find unity on imposing the sanctions. Once that unity inside the European Union was found, then the sanctions were kept in place. They had an economic impact on the Russian Federation. But then we started to realize, indeed, as the ambassador mentioned, that they didn't produce in themselves a change in behavior. And so as we keep the sanctions in place, we have been looking in Europe at what else can be put in place, what kind of diplomatic action, what kind of trigger for the Russian self-interest could be there to have a change in behavior. And that is true for Ukraine, but it's also true for other situations. I think of Moldova, Georgia, or Belarus. I mean, it's true for the entire region. In Europe, what we have understood, I think, is also that we have changed the narrative on our side. And I think this has been healthy. I remember very well in 2013, 2014, we were describing the partnerships and the association agreements we were developing with our Eastern partners, which are, for Russia, are the Western neighbors. We were defining them somehow as a binary choice. The narrative was choose your camp. Choose if you want to be close to the European Union and the West, or if you remain in the Russian sphere of influence. I think we have realized in Europe that this narrative is not helpful. This narrative actually is actually being played by Moscow to divide those societies, because none of these countries can easily and lightheartedly cut their ties with culture, language, religious community that exists with Russia. And so from I would say 2015, 2016, we have changed narrative in Europe, and we've started to say to our Eastern partners, with our Eastern neighbors, what we propose is an association or a partnership extremely close, and in some cases trade agreements and visa liberalization agreements, so very advanced, to have a very close cooperation and partnership with the European Union. But this doesn't mean automatically becoming an enemy. This is not an hostile act towards Moscow and Russia. Then obviously this narrative would need to come also from that side, and that on that I have my doubt. But at least on the European side, we've stopped putting the issue in terms of you're with us or you're against us. We recognize that you have roots, cultural roots, economic even ties, with historic ties with Russia. We are not asking you to choose, but we are offering reforms, change in your economic and institutional system that if you are interested in having, we can work on it together. And this is also the message we have passed to Moscow, that this was not an hostile act towards Russia. To tell you the truth, till 2014, for the European Union, Russia was a strategic partner. And even in NATO, we were discussing about developing a partnership with the Russian Federation. I'm still convinced that as we share the same continent, that kind of track could be useful and helpful at a certain moment to be restored. Obviously, it needs two to tango. So this narrative can come from us, but should also come from Moscow. It's not really the case. But at least on our side, we have moved from a binary choice approach towards a more cooperative choice approach. And I have to say this has helped many countries. I think of Armenia, for instance, in particular, but also others, Moldova in a certain moment of its recent history, to feel more relaxed about strengthening ties with the European Union.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. This has been a very fascinating discussion, and I'd like to thank Ambassador Collins and Rector Margarini for taking the time to share your insights with us. I'd like to thank Senator Nunn for setting us bravely on our way. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions. I'd like to thank the Nunn School and the Carnegie Endowment International Peace for making this possible. I'd particularly like to thank my colleagues, Adam Stolberg and Jenna Jordan, who did the organizational heavy lifting, and Chris McDermott and Catherine Buchanan, who made everything run so smoothly. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the Bank of America for its generous support of the Nunn Forum. From our discussion, it is clear that we cannot simply wind back the clock and go back to the way things were at the end of the Obama administration. The US has changed, the EU has changed, and the world has changed. We therefore will need to find new ways of working together. To continue that conversation, please keep an eye out for the notification for the companion events coming soon. Goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.